So first of all, if we look at FHIR, it's an HL7 standard. And sometimes when people say HL7, they think about another standard that is also part of the HL7 standard. But HL7 itself, as a term, it's just an organization. It's an accredited standards developing organization. This organization has a small paid staff and then has volunteers all over the world working in healthcare and then contributing to actually helping evolve the standards in a quality way. HL7 holds working group meetings to be able to discuss any changes to a standard. So anyone that wants to can participate in that as well. So that's important to know also for the FHIR specification, because it's still a standard that's evolving. And if you have anything that doesn't work for you in the standard, you can reach out to people that are part of the FHIR community and then contribute yourselves as well to make sure that the standard evolves in a nice way. So yeah, that's just a first. So that's what I told you with HL7 not being a standard necessarily, but being an organization developing standards. You can see that on this slide. You can see that we have a beginning of HL7 here at 1986. And then you have a whole bunch of releases. And one of the most widely known standards for HL7 is the HL7 V2 standard. So most of the time when people say something around HL7, I'm working with HL7 as a standard, they actually mean HL7 V2. If you look at this timeline, you can see FHIR has been started since 2011. So that's when FHIR came around. And of course, we will dive into that in a bit. So first of all, that HL7 V2 standard that maybe some of you know is a mechanism where you push out data. So you can see on this slide, we have an EHR that works with HL7. And when something happens on there that is interesting, something happens that it needs to send data out, this system will then send out data to client systems that receive that message that is sent. They can then either do something with that message if they're interested in it or not. So they have a choice then when they receive it, but they don't have a choice whether they want to get the data at a certain point in time. They just get it pushed to them. So that's, maybe the old way, at least that's what my slide says, but I know there are a lot of V2 systems out there. So it's still something that is going on quite a lot. On the client side, by the way, you can see there are those healthcare professionals usually working with those systems on that end to work with the data. But of course, we all know that we now have maybe cloud-based data. We have open APIs where people would want to connect to systems through using such an open API. We have JSON, we have XML, we have HTTP calls, and that's the world right now. That's what we are familiar with as developers. So you can maybe imagine that that previous way of communicating is not always the way that we these days do that, or want to do that maybe. These three people that you see here, the FHIR chiefs, they actually realized that around 2010, 2011, and they got together. They had similar ideas of, or a vision maybe, of opening up the data to systems in a different way than pushing out the messages all the time. On the left-hand side, you can see Ewout Kramer. He's my personal colleague. He's walking around at this event as well. So if you want to speak to him, please go up to him and give him a hug. He has the white label on his badge. In the middle, we have Graham Grieve. He is from Australia. He is also sometimes called the FHIR father. And then we have Lloyd McKenzie from Canada. These three started with the FHIR specification. But of course, it didn't keep to just these three people that work on the FHIR specification. We have those HL7 work groups that look at what the actual data needs to be, how that should be formed. And we have other people that are part of the FHIR core team working with the FHIR infrastructure resources, etc., than only these two. Next to the people actually actively involved in evolving the FHIR specification, we have a whole large FHIR community of people working with FHIR, discussing things around FHIR. All of you here in the room and all of you that are out there online, starting to work with FHIR maybe. And I do hope that you feel welcomed by all of the people already in the FHIR community. We try to be really open, welcoming. There is no bad questions, so please come up to us and ask, join in any of the discussions, because that will help the specification to evolve in a great way, we think. So that new vision, you can see that on this slide pictured, where you have an EHR that has an open API, a FHIR API maybe, and then you can reach out to that system to get the data from the system if you need it at that point in time, instead of having to rely on the messages being pushed out to you and maybe getting messages that you're not interested in at all. So that leads us to the FHIR specification, because that was one of the things that they envisioned, and they wanted to make sure that there is an API in FHIR. And FHIR, actually, the name is an acronym. They didn't want to call this new standard HL7 v4. Maybe it sounds a bit lame, and it doesn't sound like it's a new standard, and FHIR actually is a new standard, so that's really important to realize. It's not an update of an already existing one. You might find some things familiar in there because the FHIR people have chosen to look at other standards out there, take the good stuff from that and incorporate that in FHIR wherever possible. But FHIR is an acronym, and you can see the F stands for fast. Well, having a little bit of low barrier of entry, hopefully, if you already are familiar with XML, JSON, HTTP calls, as a developer, it's easy to get up and running with FHIR. If you focus on just a small portion of the FHIR specification at first, you should be able to do some simple things within a week and have that up and running. And also the FHIR specification should still be relatively manageable to read if you want to. We are getting bigger and bigger in the FHIR specification, so that last part is not always true anymore. H and I, they stand for healthcare interoperability, and of course that's really important. That's why we're here. We want to be interoperable in healthcare. So yeah, that's the whole idea that we have a standard like this. Then R stands for resources, which are the building blocks we have in FHIR. And in this timeline sheet, you can see the history of FHIR itself. I mentioned already, they started in 2010, 2011, discussing the possibility of a new standard. And then in 2011, the first actual draft was released. Right now, as you can see, we are on this side here. We have the official current release being R4B, but you see a lot of previous versions as well. DSTU stands for Draft Standard for Trial Use. So it was still, okay, we propose a new standard, try it out, see if you like it, give us our feedback, and then we can evolve this. As of STU3, you see there's no longer a D on there, because by then lots of people had started to look into it and actually implement things with it. So we couldn't call it draft standard anymore. It was still a standard for trial use because it did not have any normative content yet. Normative content means that that specific part of the specification will not change with any breaking changes anymore. So that's important to realize. Any of the previous releases still had no normative content, and as of FHIR release 4, we have a portion of normative content. Not the complete FHIR specification is normative. As mentioned, that means that there are still parts of the FHIR specification that can change and have breaking changes. But as long as you can focus on one version, it's perfectly okay to work with that. If you work with any portion of the FHIR specification that is not normative yet and maybe not so mature yet, it does mean that we need feedback. We need people implementing those parts of FHIR to give us that feedback to see what works, what doesn't work. So we do recommend you to use the FHIR specification and also use the non-normative portions still, because of the need for that feedback. And that means that you can help evolve the FHIR specification, and then in a way that you can work with in your implementations, hopefully. There are connectathon events at each HL7 working group meeting in order to have people participate, implement FHIR, and then also give feedback through those connectathons. So that's really helpful to gather that kind of feedback as well. So the focus of FHIR mainly is on developers, and this is a developers conference, so you're in the right place there. Another thing that you will see in the FHIR specification is that we have a kind of an 80-20 rule. Each working group that's responsible for creating resources will use that 80-20 rule to decide what will end up in the resource and what will be left out for whatever reason. Well, the main reason being it falls into the 20% category. The 80% means if something is used, is implemented in 80% of cases, roughly of course, then it will end up in the FHIR specification. If not, it's considered to be kind of an exception, and you are still able to add those parts. It will not be part of the official or the FHIR core standard, but you can still add extras, and we will see that in a bit. Other things focus on existing technologies, the newer technologies that were not present when HL7 v2 was created. Human readability is also really important. You will see that in the FHIR resources, they have field names that are English words, and they already will help you to know what can be put inside of that field. Other things would be to add summaries of the data as human readable text to each of your resources, and FHIR provides for that as well. And of course, we do love that we have a really active and nice community. So that's also a good focus for the FHIR to keep that and help each other out. Because, well, we are a bit idealistic with this standard. We want to create better healthcare for everyone all over the world. So that starts with yourselves and your loved ones, and then it will, well, hopefully gradually go over the whole world to get better. So as I said, a bit idealistic maybe, but I do like that in the FHIR specification. So the main thing, the resources, they are the building blocks. You can see them as maybe Lego implementations here. You see a couple of things there where you know there are smaller Lego blocks to form that one concept, the car or the person over there or a house. And FHIR resources are the same. They consist of small data elements inside of them, and together they form this building block, which is still relatively small as possible, and still be of interest to the healthcare domain. On the FHIR website, you can find the complete FHIR resource list. So I've put in the link on this slide. There are some foundational resources, the infrastructure actually, and then you can see some other actual healthcare data resources. For example, the patient, it's a bit invisible maybe on the side there, but that is one of the resource types that you can encounter. Next to these resource types, you can either see an N or you can see a number, and that's the maturity level of the resource. If it says N, it's a normative resource, no longer any breaking changes in a future FHIR version. If it has a number, it can still have those breaking changes. So if you use those resources, just be aware of that. Be aware of that in a future version, it may have some changes that you need to, adapt to. When you then actually look at a FHIR resource, as I said, there are those elements inside of there, those fields that actually can contain the data. So if you look at the FHIR resource type page, you can find this tree structure that is there for each resource. I've copied the patient one. You can see on the left-hand side all of the fields that are possible. So those are the field names. And as you can see, well, yeah, they are the English words that I just mentioned. Then you have the cardinality, and the cardinality indicates whether that field is a mandatory field or not, whether it can repeat or not, and that's what you can then work with. For filling in those fields, FHIR has data types. We both have primitive data types for just the actual values, string, Boolean, integer, things like that, as well as complex data types, which have a subset of information. Think about an address. An address usually has a line or a couple of lines. It has a city, a country, etc. So you will see that reflected in the FHIR data types as well. There's a way actually to know what is a primitive type or not. And you can see the types listed there in that column. Whenever it has a lowercase beginning letter, then it's a primitive type. And if it has a capital beginning letter, it will be a complex type. This is actually also reflected by the icons that you see in front of there. When it's a box type of icon, it's a complex type. And when it's more of a label icon, it's a primitive type. So that will visually help you in knowing whether you need to do some more checking for all of those subfields or whether you can fill in a value directly. There's also more description, so please do take a look at the FHIR resource types, and well, later on, if you have any questions, come up to me and I would be happy to show you around. Here's an example in JSON of a FHIR patient, and actually if we look at this, there are a couple of parts to a FHIR resource that you can encounter. So one of them would be the metadata, and in this case, metadata could consist of a last updated date, a version ID, a profile that this resource conforms to, the technical ID. I will mention that one in the next slide. But metadata around that resource. Then you have a narrative, which is supposed to contain that human readable summary. It will be put in a div, and then you can use that to render that inside of maybe a web page or anything else that can render XHTML content. So that is for the human review when your resource somehow doesn't get through the process on the system. It can still be displayed to a human without the human having to know XML or JSON and be confused about those things. We could encounter extensions, and that's that extra mechanism that we have to add the data elements that we do not find because of that 80-20 rule. So if there's anything missing from a FHIR resource from your perspective and you need that for your project, you can have extensions added to the data. They can actually be on any level, but this is the top level that I've put one extension on. And then the last part is the actual data content of the FHIR resource, which are the fields that you would see in that tree structure. So that starts with identifier there. And if you actually look at the patient resource, it has the identifier field as one of the top fields there. So extensions are actually a concept that I really like, because sometimes you just cannot have a particular element in the core FHIR resource. Example, US core race, that is common to communicate as data element in the US, but actually forbidden in some European countries. So that's something that cannot end up in the core resource, because remember, it's an international standard, so it has to be available for everyone to use without any problems. Well, at least that's, of course, one of the ideas. So the consequence of choosing what is an element in the core resource and what is not is that we also need to have those extra bits. And you can see that we have our Lego box there with those small extra parts that we want to add. And then, well, wherever you can plug them into your Lego house, you can just put them in and have the extension wherever you need it. If we look at exchanging FHIR data, then the most widely used paradigm is the RESTful paradigm. The RESTful paradigm works with HTTP calls. So if you're familiar with communicating through that, then it's easy to get to communicate FHIR resources. But it's an option, and that's what you need to remember. I know that a lot of projects have a requirement for the RESTful paradigm, but HL7 or the FHIR specification says it's an option only. So you can choose other paradigms as well if they are more applicable to your particular implementation. And then remember, the data will always be the same. So those FHIR resources that you may have created with another project for the RESTful paradigm, you can just reuse them. You don't have to change the data. You have to do a couple of things around it, but the data will stay the same. So it's easy to mix between paradigms as well. So I've talked about the RESTful paradigm working with HTTP calls and being the most widely used one. So I have two examples there. One of the things when you ask for something from the internet, you have to know the URL, right? And then you can type it in and then you can get something. So in this case, the resource that I have retrieved is the HL7 FHIR website. We can do a similar thing for FHIR as well. In this case, I've used a tool that is capable of creating those HTTP requests other than a browser, so we can actually inspect all of the responses on quite a low level. So this is a Postman tool. And what you can see, I just do a get, and that's actually what happens when you type in a URL in your browser as well. Without you knowing, it will do a get to that server to retrieve the data. And then what I've done is fill in some kind of resource identity. I know that resource identity, and then I can retrieve that with the resource's identity from the server. So in this case, I've asked for a specific patient from that server that you see, and it existed. So the response was a 200 OK instead of the 404 not found, which you're familiar with from the internet as well. And in the response, you can see a patient coming up there, and I can expect the patient's data. But of course, let me first talk about the resource's identity. FHIR has chosen to have each resource that's persisted on a system to have an identity. And that identity, I usually call it a technical identity. Some people call it a logical identity. That identity is the form of a URL. So what you see here is that we have our endpoint. You can have a path attached to that as well if you want, no problem. Then we have the resource type. The resource types are always capitalized, so capital beginning letter there. That's important in FHIR to realize. You have to use the casing correctly. So a patient. And then we have that technical ID part to the identity as well, which is what the server needs to retrieve the data with. So whenever I ask for this particular patient, the server should give me the same patient FHIR resource back every time, maybe with some changes in it, but it has that identity. That identity is also used for linking resources in FHIR, which is another important concept. So we have all of those building blocks, and then we want to be able to say, okay, I belong to that, or I have a relationship with that other FHIR resource. The resources are separate building blocks, as you may see from this example on the slide, where you see the person and the car. And in the car, in this case, we would have an indication, a field that says, oh, I want to have a pointer. I want to indicate that that person is actually my owner. So in FHIR resources, that's similar. You have fields in there where you can fill those fields with that reference, which is using the resource identity again. Here's an example of the observation resource where I have actually I've skipped a couple of things in the screenshot there, but one of the fields in the observation is the subject. And that subject is of type reference, as you can see from the type column there. It can link the observation to a patient or to a group or to a device or, well, to any of those other resource types that are listed. They are separated by the pipeline symbol to give you the choice. So I could have an observation that is an observation about my patient. And then in the subject field in the observation, if you fill it in, you will see that reference again. So in this case, this is that technical identity that we've seen previously, well, a longer one, but a technical identity for a resource. And that's how you link FHIR resources together, by using their technical identities. So that's an important concept. Oh. Okay, well, thank you. So my pointer doesn't work on the screen. I don't know if that will also online also is the same. Okay, I'm sorry about that, but well, you can see the text anyway. But so that resource identity is an important concept, but you don't always know the identity. It's the same again with retrieving a website. I said you need to know the URL, but if you don't know the URL, what would you do? You would perform a search, right? So I have a search up here for, asking for public FHIR servers, and you can see the result. And on the URL, if you have that listed, then you can see there is actually a search being done. And FHIR has a similar mechanism for FHIR searches for FHIR resources. So I've done that again with my Postman tool, where I actually have asked the server for patients that have a given name of Mirjam and then a family name of Baltus, which would then be my patient, of course. If it exists, then it will end up in the set of resources that comes out of this search. So instead of a single resource, in this case, we get a set of resources which will be embedded inside of a FHIR bundle. So you will also see FHIR bundles quite a lot because those are used to communicate sets of FHIR resources. And of course, then it's up to you to look at all of the entries in the bundle to find the resource that you are actually looking for. Or maybe you want to do something with all of the resources that came out of your search. There are a lot of search possibilities, so I will not dive into that further, but feel free to try it out yourselves. Look at the FHIR specification for the possibilities and come up to me if you have any questions during DevDays. Now, I've already mentioned extensions, which of course is a little bit of a problem. I like the mechanism technically, but you need to have some kind of an agreement on what data you send. So suppose I asked all of you, I gave you a box of Legos, and I asked all of you to build me a house. I am sure that we will see a lot of different houses. Some may have big windows, some may have small, you may have a roof with a point, or maybe not. Maybe you build some kind of more of a castle, build your dream house, right? So you will see differences. And that's where you still need to do some work. You need to make sure that everyone within your project, everyone that you need to communicate data with, is on the same level. So for that, we have something called implementation guides. And again, for Legos, we have those booklets that come with a Lego set that you can use. And now if I give you the box of Legos and I give you the booklet and say, build me a house according to these specifications, then most of the houses will look the same. There may be some small differences, but then we can revisit the book and see if you went wrong somewhere, or if some of the parts still left something up for interpretation. And that's the same with FHIR. We have FHIR implementation guides and FHIR profiles to be able to specify the FHIR specification further for our own needs, for our own projects, or for our organization. Or a country as well. You can have country-wide implementation guides and profiles. So if I talk about FHIR profiles, and I'm not going to explain them all because I have my lovely colleague Lillian here who's going to do an introduction to profiling. But a profile would be taking a FHIR resource or taking a FHIR data type and then adding some extensions to them maybe. And putting in extra requirements in the form of constraints, constraining the FHIR specification to your own needs. And that will be called a profile. Then next to profiling, you need the extra descriptions. You need those agreements, you need maybe some examples, and you can put all of that in an implementation guide where you describe how you use FHIR in that particular data exchange project. You set the expectations there. So it's really important to think about what would be in there as well when you're on the level of the modeling and the agreement side. So yeah, that's basically what tells you how to get it right if you need to work with that particular project. So as a developer, you will have the need to be able to interpret the implementation guides, even if you don't need to write them yourselves. It's really nice if someone has done that, because then you can take that and build your FHIR resources with that correctly. If you want to find profiles, we have a simplifyer.net platform, which is a public platform where you can just, without logging in, browse and find profiles and see their definitions, see the constraints that were put on top of that. And if you want to find existing implementation guides, there's an official implementation guides registry that you can see a link to here as well. Simplifyer.net, I have linked that in the slides, so hopefully when you download the PDF of the slides, you will have the link on automatically, but it's probably easy to remember, simplifyer.net. So it's always good when you are going to implement a project, to take a look at existing implementation guides that are maybe country-wide, country-specific for your country, or in a certain region or a realm that you work in. Just take a look at what's out there already to see if you also would want to conform to the things written in there. One of the ones that you will maybe want to take a look at is the US core if you are in the US, because the US core implementation guide has a lot of profiles for US specific things like that US core race extension on the patient and some other requirements that they have for US based patients. So that's definitely something that I would take a look at. Okay, so that was the main part, the information that I had for you. Of course, well, this slide just shows you where to reach out to me when you have any more questions, but I would love it if you approach me during DevDays if you're here in person, or send me a message on Whova. But if you have more generic questions around the FHIR tooling that we have, there's an email on there as well. Lots of FHIR people on site as well, by the way, so walk up to us or send an email to info@FHIR.ly. So that's my introduction. I know it's a very quick overview of FHIR, and you will need to dive into this quite a lot, let us sink in a bit, and then dive into further to actually work with FHIR. But are there any questions?
Oh, does this mic work? Yeah, thank you. So thank you, Mirjam, for all the questions. I will bring the mic because it's very important that the question is being asked in the mic, so all the online attendees can also get to know what's going on. So here, you had a question, right?
So in the slide with the observation resource, you had a subject, I guess, node over there, right, to link to another resource.
Yes.
Right. Do you have to actually put the entire, do you just put the ID of the other resource there, or do you put the entire
You
resource?
have a couple of options there, so you don't always have to put in the complete full URL of the resource identity, but you will want to always specify the resource type and the technical ID part of the resource's identity. There are some other options as well in case of a resource not having an actual identity yet, but that's beyond what I wanted to tell you here. Okay. It is the recommendation to put in the full URL if at all possible, okay. Because then you specify the actual system that this resource came from, so anyone else can then also, well, when they need it, they may be able to retrieve it by just using that URL without going through all kinds of hoops to construct the complete URL. Okay, so we have two options, like put the entire FHIR server URL for that resource, or just put like patient / Yes, yes, correct. Okay, thank you.
Okay, I see another question over here.
I'm curious about the vision of the whole FHIR thing. Does the vision include that, or hopeful that FHIR will replace HL7 v2?
I would hope for that, but I'm not HL7, so I can say that maybe. No, we would not expect you to replace existing systems that work well. So what we have seen with the FHIR implementation is that at first you have implementations that build on top of what you already have. So it may be opening up your system through maybe a patient portal or an appointment service that you create with FHIR, instead of changing your complete system. That would just be throwing away money, and no one wants that, as long as it still works. But FHIR is suitable for creating a complete system from scratch, and I have seen some examples as well. But that means that you would not have any legacy system, then you can do that. But in the end, in 20 years from now, I would expect HL7 v2 to have more and more disappeared, because this is newer technology. It's more suited for what we have these days, but it's not necessarily the intent, more of a consequence of having a new standard. And with that, FHIR probably will not be the last healthcare standard created. So maybe in 50 years from now, if we can still live to see that, we have a different standard that replaces FHIR again.
Nice. Thank you, Mirjam. We have another question, and we still have 5 minutes, so if you have questions.
Hi there. I have a two-part question here. The first is, I'm not sure I fully understood the difference between the implementation guides and profiles. They both seem sort of like similar, more granular descriptions of a particular implementation of FHIR. And my second question is, regarding profiles on simplifyer.net, I'm not entirely clear what I would be looking for there. Generally, when we've implemented FHIR projects, we're looking at the EMR vendors' specifications because that's going to be more accurate to what actually works. So who are making these profiles on simplifyer.net, and an example of when that would be useful?
Yeah. So profiles would just be taking one FHIR resource or one FHIR data type at a time and then putting your constraints on there and your extras. Implementation guides are the broader thing, so that would be my starting point, actually, going through to the documentation around what you want to achieve with the FHIR resources. So hopefully that answers at least part of your question. HL7 affiliates create implementation guides and profiles, but also just organizations, any organization within a country that needs to have specifics on the FHIR resources can do that. It's not mandatory to publish your profiles on Simplifier, but we do make sure we have contact with HL7 affiliates to put them on there. Yeah, so I would probably first browse the implementation guides to see if there's anything relevant to you. But it could be that, for example, if you work on the Dutch market, there's no implementation guide in that registry that I mentioned. Then within the Netherlands, you would, well, we know that because we live there, we work there. We know that there's another organization that works with standardization of healthcare, together with HL7 in the Netherlands, by the way. And they have created their set of profiles and put that on Simplifier. So yeah, you have to do a little bit of research though. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk, Mirjam. I have a question on, so the first foundational steps of FHIR were laid more than 10 years ago. How is FHIR keeping up with new technologies? I think next to REST APIs, there's some newer APIs, newer programming languages coming up and things.
Yeah, so if you have anything that you think is interesting and also would align with sharing healthcare data, I would advise to just join the FHIR community and give your feedback there. FHIR is still evolving, as I said, and I mentioned XML and JSON as formats for the FHIR resources, but there's also YAML and there's also RDF. I think RDF is in the standard, but YAML is still being added to see how we would do that. And that the same way you could have other formats added. Well, the RESTful API is specified on the FHIR website, but if there's another kind of thing that you would want to have there, then well, it could end up as part of the FHIR specification. It's not a fixed thing. It's dynamic. So yeah, well, everyone, do show us what you're doing and what you think is also a good idea to add to the FHIR specification. Yeah.
Hi, thank you. Can companies create their own custom resources if there isn't any relevant resource with FHIR? And if so, do they have to get affiliated to publish them on FHIR?
Technically, it's possible, but we would not recommend it because all of the FHIR tooling, the libraries that are out there, there are programming libraries already available for a lot of languages. They would not be able to work with them by default, so we would not recommend it. But technically, it is possible because you can create that structure, that's your custom resource. But you could look into, for now, using the basic FHIR resource type, then creating a lot of extensions on there. So it is a bit of work, but for each of the things that you would put in your structure, you can add an extension to the basic FHIR resource type, and then you can communicate it. It will not really look nice, but at least it's an option to put your own data in a custom data in a FHIR, an actual FHIR resource that doesn't break the tooling and servers and things like that.
Okay, so considering time, we still have 1 minute, and I saw a question over here. So this will be the last question, but like Mirjam told before, you can ask all your questions
We
afterwards.
just need
right?
to close, I think, the online session in a bit, but yeah, feel free to walk up to me and ask your
So
questions. there.
here's the last question.
Are we allowed to ask question online?
Yes, yes, definitely. I will also watch Hoova to see if there are any more questions coming in, and I will make sure that either Ardon or me responds to those questions as well.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes. This is a two-part question. The first part is I would just like to double click on the implementation versus profiles question. What is included in an implementation guide that's not included in a profile? Like, is it like person A will send this and person B will send this in return? Like, what are the standard kind of ingredients of a implementation guide besides a profile?
Yeah, so that would be indeed the roles of the systems within the communication. It could include just some text, so a developer can read that, and they could also give you some ideas on how to communicate resources. So maybe put in some RESTful calls as examples to show what the idea is. Also link to example resources that conform to the profiles that are part of your project, things like that. So there's a lot of things around it that you can do as actual documentation for the project.
Got it. That's really helpful. Thank you. And when you mentioned that some FHIR resources are, I forget the word that you used, but basically can't have like any breaking changes at a certain point. Right. I'm assuming that like FHIR versions, of course, will update like in time, like just in the way that there is HL7, V2, V3, like FHIR assuredly will have a similar thing in the future.
Yes.
What is the relationship between those like non-breaking changes on those resources and like future FHIR versions?
So in future FHIR versions, then, well, they cannot have any changes that break existing implementations if something is normative in the current version.
Got it. Okay. So from V2 to V3, if something is normative, they won't have a breaking change in like FHIR V3 one day, you're saying?
Correct.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. And of course, each version is fixed in time as well. So at the moment, it's FHIR R4B, which is the official version. That will not change anymore. Maybe some technical corrections in the text, but other than that, it will not change. So you have a fixed point in time that you can work with resources and all of the descriptions around that. And there's also, by the way, a possibility to see a preview of what's coming on the FHIR website. You can see all of the previous versions as well as the next version coming up and what the changes are. But that is still a dynamic thing, so you will have to take care in actually implementing against that preview of the next version.
Okay, thank you very much, Mirjam. I think we're running out of time, so we're closing.
Well, thank you all for your attention. I hope you have a really great rest of your dev days and see you around.